1944. The war is turning. Allied armies push east from Normandy. Soviet forces drive west through the ruins of Poland. The Third Reich is collapsing on the battlefield. But inside Germany's factories, the killing has not slowed. In some places, it is accelerating. On a desk in a corporate office, an invoice is prepared. Not for steel, not for fuel, for people. 4 Reichsmarks per day for an unskilled concentration camp prisoner, 3 for a skilled one. The payment is sent directly to the SS. The workers themselves receive nothing. No wages, almost no food, no medical care. When exhaustion, disease, or brutality kills them, replacements arrive within days. Another train, another transport, another shipment of labor drawn from the camps of a dying regime. This was not corruption at the margins of Nazi Germany. It was policy, structured, contracted, accounted for. Across the Reich and the occupied territories, hundreds of companies leased prisoners from the SS. By the final years of the war, a vast network of sub-camps existed for a single purpose: to feed human bodies into mines, chemical plants, aircraft factories, and steel works. Industrial production and mass imprisonment had fused into one system. A machinery of profit, powered by people, the regime had already marked for destruction. Some were Jews, others were Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, political opponents, Romani families, Jehovah's Witnesses. All were reduced to labor units measured in output, cost, and expected lifespan. And the men who ran the companies knew. The engineers knew. The accountants who calculated daily rates knew. Yet after the war ended, many walked free. Factories reopened, brands survived, profits returned, and the deeper story of corporate complicity faded into silence. This film uncovers that story. How German industry became entangled with the concentration camp system, who benefited, and why accountability remained so incomplete. Because behind the front lines of World War II, another battle was being fought. Not for territory, but for profit. And to understand it, we must follow the money to the darkest place it led. To understand how German industry became entangled with the Holocaust, you have to understand one man's ambition and one institution's insatiable need for revenue. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, was by 1939 among the most powerful men in Germany. He commanded the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which controlled the concentration camp network, the security police, and vast portions of the occupied territories. But Himmler had a problem. The SS was expensive to run. Its empire of camps, personnel, and infrastructure cost more than it generated. And so Himmler, with the systematic precision that defined everything he touched, set about turning the camps into an economic engine. The concept was simple. The SS held enormous numbers of prisoners. German industry needed labor, desperately so, as millions of able-bodied German men were absorbed into the Wehrmacht. The two problems could solve each other. In 1942, Himmler formalized what had already been developing organically. The SS would rent its prisoners to private companies at a set daily rate. The companies would provide the work sites, often adjacent to or inside concentration camp sub-camps. The SS would provide guards, administration, and a continuous supply of new prisoners to replace those who died. Everyone, in the language of the system, was a resource. The SS Economics and Administrative Main Office, known by its German acronym WVHA, became the bureaucratic engine of this arrangement. It negotiated contracts, set prices, tracked prisoner numbers, and ensured the smooth transfer of human beings from camp to factory. The language used in its correspondence was entirely administrative. Workers were described in terms of capacity and efficiency. Death was recorded as attrition. The paperwork was meticulous. German companies did not need to be coerced into participation. Many came willingly, eagerly even, Labor costs were a fraction of what free German workers would demand. There were no unions, no sick days, no insurance obligations, no minimum wages. A prisoner who collapsed on the factory floor could simply be sent back to the camp and replaced. The financial logic was, from a cold accounting perspective, nearly irresistible. By 1944, an estimated 600,000 concentration camp prisoners were engaged in forced labor for private industry. The number would fluctuate as deportations accelerated and death rates climbed, but the scale was enormous. Sub-camps proliferated around major industrial sites, mines, factories, construction projects, forming a shadow geography of forced labor that stretched across occupied Europe. And who were these companies? Some names are perhaps expected. Others will surprise you. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate, was among the most deeply implicated. Its leadership had lobbied the SS directly for access to Auschwitz prisoner labor, and in 1941 broke ground on Auschwitz III, the Monowitz camp, sometimes called Buna, specifically to house workers for its synthetic rubber and fuel plant. The company invested over 1 billion Reichsmarks in the facility. It employed over 35,000 prisoners over the course of the war. The mortality rate among those workers was catastrophic. Then there was Krupp, the arms and steel dynasty that had supplied German militarism through 2 world wars. By 1943, Krupp was operating prisoner labor at multiple sites, including within Auschwitz itself, where Jewish women from Hungary were assigned to its fuse assembly facility. Alfred Krupp, who ran the company during the war, would later be tried at Nuremberg, one of the few industrialists to face formal judgment. BMW manufactured aircraft engines and motorcycle components using forced labor from concentration camps, including Dachau. Daimler-Benz, today's Mercedes-Benz, used prisoners from Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, and Vaihingen. Volkswagen, founded under the Nazi regime itself, worked thousands of forced laborers, including concentration camp prisoners, at its Wolfsburg plant. Siemens, the electrical engineering giant whose name still appears on turbines, medical equipment, and household appliances, operated labor installations at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and several other camps. Its prisoners assembled electronic components, including parts used in the V-2 rocket program. Hugo Boss, the fashion house, manufactured SS and Wehrmacht uniforms using forced labor from concentration and POW camps. The company acknowledged this history publicly in 2011, commissioning an independent historical study that confirmed the use of around 140 forced laborers at its Metzingen factory during the war. These are not peripheral figures in the story of the Holocaust. They are central to it. Their demands for labor drove the expansion of the camp system. Their capital funded the infrastructure that kept the system running. And their silence after 1945 helped ensure that the full story was not told for decades. But telling it requires going deeper into the camps themselves and into the daily reality of those who worked and died within them. Because the invoice was 4 Reichsmarks per day, and behind every invoice was a human being. In the spring of 1941, a delegation of executives from IG Farben traveled to Auschwitz. They were not there to inspect the camp's operations. They were there to select a site. The company wanted to build a synthetic rubber and fuel plant, known as Buna-Werke, and they needed a location that combined industrial infrastructure with an essentially unlimited supply of cheap labor. Auschwitz offered both. It sat on a rail junction, it had water access, and it had Heinrich Himmler's enthusiastic cooperation. IG Farben, at this point, was the largest chemical corporation in the world. Its products ranged from aspirin and dyestuffs to synthetic gasoline and, critically, Zyklon B, the pesticide that would later be repurposed as the killing agent in the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. That last detail is one of the more grotesque ironies of the entire war. The company, whose workers were dying inside Auschwitz, had a subsidiary, Degisch, that manufactured the gas used to kill other Auschwitz prisoners in the chambers nearby. The plant was designated Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. Construction began in 1941. Thousands of prisoners were marched from Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, Birkenau, to the construction site each day, a round trip of several miles on top of 12 or more hours of physical labor. Many did not survive the commute. Those who became too weak to work were returned to Birkenau, where they were selected for the gas chambers. IG Farben's foreman participated directly in these selections, identifying those too exhausted or ill to continue. Primo Levi, the Italian Jewish chemist and writer who survived Monowitz, described the site in his memoir, "If this is a man," with the precision of someone still trying to make sense of what he witnessed. He wrote of the factory floor as a place governed entirely by force. Foremen who beat prisoners for slowing down, guards who shot those who stumbled, and a daily arithmetic of survival that left no room for anything resembling humanity. He was one of the few Monowitz prisoners whose professional skills, he was assigned to the plant's chemistry laboratory, gave him marginally better odds. Most had no such protection. Over the course of the war, IG Farben employed between 30,000 and 35,000 concentration camp prisoners at Monowitz alone, in addition to using forced laborers at other sites across occupied Europe. The company paid the SS the agreed daily rate, and in return was relieved of virtually all other obligations. It did not pay for food beyond the minimum the SS provided, a diet calibrated to extract maximum labor before physical collapse. It did not pay for medical treatment. It did not pay for the bodies that were carried out each morning. What did IG Farben get in return? Ultimately, very little. The Buna plant never reached full production. Allied bombing raids and the advancing Soviet front forced its evacuation before the synthetic rubber could be manufactured at scale. The billion Reichsmark investment produced almost no usable output, but in the process it consumed thousands of lives. This ratio, enormous human cost, marginal economic return, recurs throughout the history of concentration camp forced labor. Many historians have noted the profound irrationality of the system from a purely economic standpoint. Starved, brutalized prisoners are not efficient workers. Their productivity was significantly lower than that of free laborers would have been. The camps generated chronic shortages of equipment, trained supervisors, and basic tools. The SS bureaucracy was perpetually mismanaged, yet the system continued and expanded because it served other purposes beyond pure economic gain. It was an expression of ideology as much as economics. The use of prisoner labor was, simultaneously, a form of punishment, a method of extermination. Death through work was explicit Nazi policy, Vernichtung durch Arbeit, and a statement of ownership. These people belonged to the Reich. Their bodies were Reich property. Companies that used them were not just hiring workers. They were participating in the symbolic order of the Nazi world. After the war, the Nuremberg military tribunals established a specific court to address IG Farben's crimes. The IG Farben trial of 1947 and 1948. 23 executives were indicted. 13 were convicted. The sentences ranged from 18 months to 8 years. All were released by 1951, many to resume prominent positions in West German industry. The company itself was dissolved, broken into successor firms, including Bayer, BASF, and Horst. These companies acknowledged varying degrees of responsibility for the parent company's wartime conduct over subsequent decades. In 1995, a group of former forced laborers filed suit in German courts. In 2000, Germany established a foundation, Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft, or Remembrance, Responsibility, and the Future, which eventually distributed approximately 4.4 billion euros to former forced laborers and their heirs. IG Farben itself, or rather its legal shell, was not fully wound down in German courts until 2012, 67 years after the war ended. But IG Farben was not the only corporation deep in the machinery of death. Across the Reich, another industrial dynasty was supplying the Wehrmacht's appetite for steel and finding in the concentration camps an answer to its own labor shortages. The name Krupp had been synonymous with German military power for over a century. Through the Franco-Prussian War, through the First World War, through the rearmament of the 1930s, the Krupp dynasty had supplied the cannons, the armor plate, the artillery shells that defined German military ambition. By the Second World War, Krupp AG was one of the largest industrial conglomerates in Europe, employing hundreds of thousands of workers across dozens of factories and mines. At its head sat Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, who had taken control of the company in 1943 following the forced retirement of his father. Alfred Krupp was not an accidental participant in the forced labor system. He was, by the evidence presented at his trial, an active and enthusiastic one. As early as 1942, Krupp facilities were drawing on prisoners from German concentration camps. By 1943, as the labor shortage intensified, Krupp moved to expand these arrangements dramatically. A fuse factory was established within the Auschwitz camp complex, staffed almost entirely by Hungarian Jewish women who had been deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in the massive transports of 1944. Survivors later testified that Krupp's foremen beat workers who fell behind, and that those who became too weak to meet production quotas were returned to Birkenau for selection. Elsewhere, Krupp operated facilities using prisoners from Buchenwald, Flossenbürg and Neuengamme, among other camps. At its Essen headquarters, the company established a facility that used prisoners, including Jewish deportees, to perform precision metalwork under conditions that witnesses described as deliberately punitive. Krupp also participated in one of the darkest sub-chapters of the forced labor system, the use of Soviet prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were entitled to certain protections: adequate food, shelter, and exemption from dangerous labor. The Nazi regime rejected these protections for Soviet prisoners specifically, designating them as racially inferior and therefore outside the conventions of civilized warfare. Soviet POWs died in German captivity at a staggering rate. An estimated 3.3 million died between 1941 and 1945, roughly 57% of all Soviet soldiers captured. Many died in the labor installations of German industry. Krupp used Soviet POWs at multiple facilities. The conditions they described in post-war testimonies were consistent: inadequate food, brutal discipline, and a calculated indifference to survival. The company's internal correspondence, preserved and used as evidence at Nuremberg, included discussions of how to maximize productivity from prisoners while keeping costs, and therefore the price paid to the SS, as low as possible. At the Nuremberg military tribunals, Alfred Krupp was tried before the so-called Krupp trial in 1947 and 1948. He was convicted of plunder and the use of slave labor. The sentence was 12 years imprisonment and confiscation of all his personal property. It was one of the harshest sentences handed down to any industrialist. He served 3 years. In 1951, U.S. High Commissioner John J. McCloy, acting under political pressure related to West Germany's integration into the emerging Cold War alliance, issued an amnesty for most of the convicted Nuremberg war criminals who remained in prison. Krupp was released and his confiscated property restored. He returned to the helm of his company, resumed his position in German industrial society, and died in 1967 as one of the wealthiest men in Europe. The victims he had employed, and for many of whom his factories had been a prelude to death, received nothing from him directly. The company eventually contributed to the German forced labor compensation program established in 2000, decades after Alfred's death. The Krupp case illuminated something that the broader post-war political settlement would spend decades obscuring. The decision not to pursue comprehensive corporate accountability was not an oversight. It was a choice. The reconstruction of West Germany as an industrial democracy, as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, required the rehabilitation of German industry, and that meant allowing companies to quietly move past their wartime histories. Executives were released early. Convictions were downplayed or forgotten. Corporate archives were selectively preserved or, in some cases, quietly managed. It would take a new generation of historians and a new generation of survivors willing to speak to begin pulling back the curtain, and as that curtain lifted, other names emerged. Names that were not arms dealers or chemical conglomerates. Names that appeared in the everyday consumer world, in the garage, in the living room, on the street. The story of corporate complicity was not confined to the Krupps and the Farbens of the Reich. It ran through the entire fabric of German industrial life, and none of those companies were more carefully reconstructed or more carefully memorialized in post-war myth than the ones that built the cars. Volkswagen, the people's car, was, in a very literal sense, a Nazi creation. The company was conceived by Adolf Hitler and the German Labor Front in 1937 as part of a propaganda campaign to bring automobile ownership within reach of ordinary German workers. Ferdinand Porsche designed the vehicle, the iconic rounded shape that would eventually become one of the best-selling cars in automotive history. A factory was built at Wolfsburg. Hundreds of thousands of German workers enrolled in a savings scheme to purchase their own Volkswagen. None of them ever received one. When war broke out in 1939, the Wolfsburg factory, barely operational, was immediately converted to military production. The savings collected from would-be car buyers were absorbed into the war economy, never to be returned. And to staff the factory, Volkswagen turned to forced labor. The scale was substantial. Over the course of the war, Volkswagen employed an estimated 20,000 forced laborers at Wolfsburg. They included concentration camp prisoners, primarily from the Neuengamme camp network, foreign civilian workers conscripted from occupied territories, and Soviet POWs. Among the most disturbing aspects of the Wolfsburg operation was the fate of the children, female workers who became pregnant, many as a result of sexual violence, were forced to continue working, and their infants were placed in a facility attached to the plant. The conditions in that facility were so poor that most of the babies died. Post-war investigations documented at least 350 infant deaths at the Volkswagen nursery. Volkswagen did not formally acknowledge this history until the 1980s, when pressure from historians and surviving former laborers forced the company to commission an independent study. The company contributed to the German Compensation Fund in 2000, though many survivors had already died without receiving anything. BMW's wartime conduct followed a similar pattern. The Munich-based manufacturer, primarily known then for aircraft engines rather than automobiles, established forced labor installations at several of its plants, drawing on prisoners from Dachau and other camps. At the BMW plant in Allach, near Munich, a dedicated sub-camp housed approximately 6,000 prisoners at its peak. Many were worked on the production of aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe. Conditions at Allach were, by the accounts of survivors, particularly brutal. The mortality rate among prisoners was high, even by the grim standards of the forced labor system. Daimler-Benz, manufacturer of Mercedes-Benz automobiles and the engines that powered much of the German military's motorized fleet, was no different. The company used forced laborers at multiple sites, drawing on prisoners from Sachsenhausen, Natzweiler, Vaihingen, and other camps. At its Sindelfingen plant, Jewish Hungarian women deported in 1944 performed assembly work under supervision that survivors described as relentlessly violent. The company's archives, reviewed by historian Neil Gregor in his 1998 study Daimler-Benz in the Third Reich, revealed an organization that pursued access to concentration camp labor with deliberate intent. Not reluctantly, but as a preferred solution to its wartime labor problems. What distinguished the automotive company's experience from that of Krupp or IG Farben was the speed and success with which they reconstructed their public images after 1945. What distinguished the automotive company's experience from that of Krupp or IG Farben was the speed and success with which they reconstructed their public images after 1945. The post-war Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle, was built on the recovery of exactly these industries. Volkswagen's Beetle became a global cultural icon of the 1960s, associated in the American market with anti-establishment values and cheerful frugality. The darkness of the factory's wartime origins was not part of that image. This image management was not purely accidental. German companies in the post-war era invested significantly in corporate mythology, founding narratives that emphasized innovation, quality, and democratic values. The wartime years were treated as an aberration, a period in which essentially decent companies were caught up in a criminal state's demands. The agency, the deliberate choices made by boards of directors and plant managers, was systematically downplayed. It took decades of scholarship, legal action, and survivor testimony to complicate that narrative. Bernd Greiner, Neil Gregor, Adam Tooze, historians who examined the internal records of German companies with access to previously restricted archives, found a more troubling picture. Companies that had competed for prisoner labor contracts, that had lobbied the SS for preferred allocation, that had knowingly participated in a system designed to work human beings to death. But even as the automotive companies' histories came under scrutiny, another set of corporations remained in the shadows. Companies whose products were not tanks or cars, but items so mundane, so woven into the fabric of modern life, that their wartime histories felt almost impossible to reconcile. Companies that made the clothes, companies that made the medicine, companies that lit the buildings and wired the machines. The banality of their products made the nature of their crimes, in some ways, even harder to process. Because banality, as Hannah Arendt had observed in another context, was precisely the point. Siemens today is one of the world's largest industrial conglomerates, a company whose products span power generation, digital infrastructure, healthcare technology, and transportation. Its revenues run to tens of billions of euros. Its name is a shorthand for German engineering excellence. During the Second World War, Siemens operated forced labor installations at over a dozen sites, including at Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp for women in the Third Reich, and at Auschwitz-Birkenau itself. At Ravensbrück, Siemens recruited female prisoners, many of them Jewish, Polish, and Soviet, to assemble electrical components for telecommunications equipment and military hardware. The company had its own factory building within the camp perimeter. Survivors testified that working conditions were better than in some other camp labor assignments, not because Siemens was humane, but because the precision work required for electronics demanded a degree of physical stability that outright starvation made impossible. When workers became too weak to perform the required tasks, they were returned to the camp's general population and replaced. The women who worked for Siemens inside Ravensbrück were not volunteers. They were concentration camp prisoners with all that designation implied. No wages, no freedom of movement, no legal protection, no recourse against violence or arbitrary punishment. Siemens paid the SS the standard daily rental fee and, in return, received their labor. Siemens also participated in the V2 rocket program, the Nazi regime's most technically ambitious weapons project. At the Mittelwerk facility, a network of underground tunnels carved into the Harz Mountains by concentration camp prisoners from Dora. Companies including Siemens and the electrical firm AEG produced components for the rocket. The construction of the Mittelwerk was itself one of the most lethal forced labor projects of the war. An estimated 20,000 prisoners died during the tunneling and construction phase alone, from exhaustion, beatings, disease, and hanging. The SS at Dora executed hundreds of prisoners accused of sabotage, publicly as a deterrent to the workforce. Then there is Bayer, today a global pharmaceutical giant, one of whose flagship products is aspirin. Bayer during the war was a component of IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate examined earlier, and its wartime conduct cannot be fully separated from the parent companies. But Bayer's specific legacy within the IG Farben story carries a particular weight because it is connected to one of the most monstrous figures to operate within the camp system, Dr. Joseph Mengele. IG Farben, including the Bayer division, funded and provided materials for medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners without their consent. The company supplied pharmaceutical products to camp physicians for testing on human subjects. Bayer specifically was in contact with SS doctors at Auschwitz regarding experiments involving new drugs. In one documented case, Bayer purchased a group of female prisoners from the Auschwitz SS for experimental purposes. The correspondence was businesslike, the language entirely clinical. The women were transferred, experimented upon, and most died. The individuals who conducted these experiments, Mengele foremost among them, bore the primary moral weight of those crimes. But the institutional framework that enabled them, that funded them and provided their materials and treated their subjects as purchasable, was corporate as much as military. After the war, Bayer was reconstituted as an independent company following IG Farben's dissolution. It paid into the German compensation fund. It has, in various statements over the decades, acknowledged the crimes committed under the IG Farben umbrella. But the relationship between acknowledgement and accountability is complex. And the passage of time, the deaths of survivors, the diffusion of corporate identity across successor companies have made the reckoning incomplete. Hugo Boss presents a different dimension of the story. Not industrial production, but the clothing of the perpetrators themselves. The company, founded by Hugo Ferdinand Boss in 1924, manufactured uniforms for the SS, the Hitler Youth, and the Wehrmacht. It used forced laborers to meet wartime production demands. Hugo Boss himself was a member of the Nazi Party. After the war, he was tried by a German denazification court and fined. The fine was equivalent to roughly $1,500 in contemporary terms. He lost the right to vote for several years. He died in 1948. The company that bore his name grew into a global luxury fashion brand. In 2011, it commissioned an independent study from historian Roman Köster and formally apologized for its use of forced labor, the first major German fashion brand to do so. An apology 80 years after the fact, to survivors who were, by then, in their 90s or already gone. This was the rhythm of corporate reckoning in post-war Germany. Slow, incomplete, and always shadowed by the question of what accountability actually means when those most responsible are no longer alive. The trials at Nuremberg had tried to answer that question. They had not fully succeeded. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a moment, brief, fragile, and ultimately incomplete, when the machinery of corporate complicity appeared ready to face justice. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which concluded in October 1946, addressed the crimes of the senior Nazi political and military leadership. It did not comprehensively address corporate responsibility. That task fell to the subsequent Nuremberg military tribunals, 12 additional proceedings conducted by American military authorities between 1946 and 1949 under Control Council Law Number 10. Several of these trials directly addressed industrial complicity. The IG Farben trial, the Krupp trial, and the Flick trial, named for Friedrich Flick, the steel and coal magnate, examined the conduct of major industrialists who had profited from forced labor and participated in the looting of property in occupied territories. The evidence was damning. The documentation was extensive. Convictions were obtained, and then, almost immediately, the sentences began to erode. The political context was decisive. By 1947 and 1948, the emerging Cold War was reshaping American foreign policy in Germany. The Soviet Union was consolidating control over Eastern Europe. West Germany was becoming a critical bulwark in the emerging Western alliance. American policy shifted toward rapid reconstruction of the West German economy and state, which meant the rehabilitation of German industry. John J. McCloy, who served as U.S. High Commissioner for Germany from 1949 to 1952, was the architect of this rehabilitation. In January 1951, he issued clemency orders that reduced sentences or secured the release of the majority of the industrialists convicted at Nuremberg. Alfred Krupp walked free, his property restored. The IG Farben executives, who had received sentences between 18 months and 8 years, were all released by 1951. Friedrich Flick, convicted of using forced labor at his mining and steel operations, served 3 years of a 7-year sentence. He subsequently rebuilt his industrial empire and died in 1972 as the wealthiest man in West Germany. None of them paid a pfennig in compensation to their former forced laborer. The West German legal system provided few additional opportunities for accountability. German courts were initially constrained by procedural and political factors. Many judges and prosecutors had themselves been members of the Nazi Party, and the political will to pursue corporate defendants was limited. Statutes of limitations on many civil claims had expired or were allowed to expire. Corporate successor companies carefully distanced themselves from the wartime identities of their predecessors. The historian Benjamin Ferencz, who served as chief prosecutor in the IG Farben trial at the age of 27 and would dedicate much of his life to the pursuit of accountability, spent decades afterward reflecting on what had been achieved and what had not. He witnessed firsthand the gap between the justice that had been possible in 1947 and the justice that was actually delivered. "We had the evidence," he said in interviews many years later. "We had the law. What we did not have was the political will to see it through. For decades, the survivors of the forced labor system lived in countries, many of them in Eastern Europe, under Soviet-aligned governments, that complicated or blocked their access to any compensation claims against West German companies. The Iron Curtain effectively sealed their stories away from Western legal and public consciousness. Former forced laborers in Poland, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia had no access to German courts and received nothing. It was not until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the reunification of Germany, and after a series of class action lawsuits filed in American courts by survivor groups, that the pressure finally became sufficient to produce a systematic response. The turning point came through litigation strategy in the United States. American lawyers, working with survivor organizations, began filing suit in U.S. federal courts against German companies with American operations, Volkswagen, Siemens, Daimler, Deutsche Bank, and others. The legal theory was contested and the outcomes uncertain, but the suits generated enormous public and diplomatic pressure. The German government, under Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, and a coalition of major German corporations responded by negotiating the establishment of the Foundation for Remembrance, Responsibility and the Future, in German Stiftung Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft. In 2000, the foundation raised approximately 10 billion Deutschmarks, roughly 5 billion euros, from the German government and participating companies. Payments were distributed to former forced laborers and their heirs through partner organizations in multiple countries. By the time distributions began, the majority of forced laborers from the war years had died. The average surviving recipient was in their late 80s. The payments they received, ranging from a few hundred to several thousand euros, were described universally as symbolic. Symbolic. That word carried enormous weight because the companies involved had extracted real profit from real bodies. What was the meaning of a symbolic payment to a 90-year-old survivor? It was, at minimum, an acknowledgement that something had happened, that it was wrong, that the companies who had profited from it bore some responsibility. It was also, undeniably, much less than justice. For those who survived the forced labor system, the war never truly ended. It ended logistically, administratively. The camps were liberated, the contracts terminated, the SS dissolved. But the physical and psychological consequences followed survivors for the rest of their lives. And for many decades, what they carried was not just personal memory. It was testimony that the world had not yet fully heard. Primo Levi returned from Auschwitz Monowitz to Turin in 1945. He had been a prisoner of IG Farben's Buna works, one of the tens of thousands who had passed through Monowitz's gates. He worked as a chemist, rebuilt his professional life, and wrote. His memoir, If This Is a Man, published in 1947, was initially rejected by the major Italian publishers and appeared in a small edition that attracted minimal attention. It was reissued in 1958 to wider recognition and eventually translated into dozens of languages. For the rest of his life, Levi wrote and spoke about the necessity of memory, not as therapy or catharsis, but as a form of historical witness that he believed was morally obligatory. He was specific about the industrial character of Auschwitz. He described the Buna plant not as a site of chaos, but of order. A perverted, lethal order, but order nonetheless. The company's presence imposed a kind of industrial rationality on the camp's violence. You worked or you were selected. The factory floor was an extension of the camp's logic, not a departure from it. Levi died in 1987 in a fall from the staircase of his Turin apartment building. Whether it was suicide or an accident remains uncertain. He was 67 years old. Leon Greenman, a British citizen who had been living in the Netherlands when he was deported to Auschwitz in 1943, survived Birkenau and Monowitz, where he worked in IG Farben's Buna construction. His wife and infant son were gassed on arrival. Greenman spent the rest of his life as a witness, speaking in schools, museums, and public forums across Britain until shortly before his death in 2008 at the age of 97. He understood his role clearly as the generation of survivors thinned. Those who remained carried the memory of those who had not. Shmuel Gogol, a Polish Jewish survivor of multiple concentration camps, including a Daimler-Benz sub-camp, was among those who eventually filed claims as part of the legal pressure that led to the 2000 foundation. He received a payment. He was asked in a documentary interview whether it was enough. He considered the question carefully. "It is not about enough," he said. "It is about, do they know what they did? Do they say it plainly? That they took everything from us and gave us nothing, and then built their companies on our graves?" The question of acknowledgement, of plainly stated, unambiguous acknowledgement, runs through the entire history of corporate reckoning with forced labor. What survivors consistently described as essential was not primarily the money. It was the naming, the explicit, corporate, institutional acknowledgement that specific companies had done specific things to specific people, deliberately, for profit. Some companies provided that acknowledgement more fully than others. Volkswagen's Historical Commission produced a detailed, unsparing account of the Wolfsburg plant's wartime operations, including the deaths of the infants in the factory nursery. Daimler's corporate archive cooperated with independent historians who documented the company's use of concentration camp prisoners in detail. Siemens issued formal statements acknowledging its operations at Ravensbrück and elsewhere. Others were slower or more equivocal. The language of corporate apology frequently emphasized the wartime context. the pressures of the Nazi regime, the complicity of the broader German state, in ways that distributed responsibility rather than concentrating it. But the historians who had spent careers in the archives knew what the documents said. They knew that company executives had written letters requesting prisoner allocations, had negotiated payment terms with the SS, had chosen to build factories adjacent to death camps because the labor was cheaper and more controllable than free workers. They had made decisions, legal, commercial, operational decisions, that resulted in the deaths of human beings. Adam Tooze, in his comprehensive economic history of the Nazi state, The Wages of Destruction, described the relationship between German industry and the camp system not as a reluctant collaboration, but as a structural feature of the Nazi war economy, one that neither side could have maintained without the other. The camps needed the companies to justify prisoner labor as economically productive. The companies needed the camps to solve their labor shortages. They built the system together. The question of how to remember that, how to assign it meaning that survives the death of the last witness, remains urgent, because the last witnesses are almost gone. In 1944, the invoice was 4 Reichsmarks per day for a human being, for a day of their life, for whatever they could produce before their body gave out. It is a small number. It was a small number even then. But it is, in some ways, the most clarifying fact in this entire story, because it reduces everything to its essential transaction. A corporation made a payment. A human being was delivered. Work was extracted. When the work could no longer be extracted, the person was discarded. This was not an aberration within an otherwise functioning economic system. It was the system, operating exactly as designed. The bureaucracy was efficient. The invoices were accurate. The deliveries were on schedule. The companies received what they paid for. What they paid for was the temporary use of people who had been stripped by law and by force of every other category of identity, of citizenship, of personhood, of any claim on the conscience of those who employed them. The corporations examined in this documentary, IG Farben, Krupp, Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler, Siemens, Bayer, and the dozens of others that participated in the forced labor system, did not create the Holocaust. That crime belongs primarily to the Nazi state and the ideology that drove it. But these companies provided something the Holocaust required, the infrastructure of its daily operation. They supplied the administrative logic that made mass murder economically legible. They turned the camp system into an industrial proposition. And in doing so, they made it, paradoxically, more sustainable, because it generated revenue, and revenue generated institutional momentum. After the war, most of them survived. Most of them rebuilt. Most of their executives faced no consequences. The market, given time, absorbed the history. What resists absorption is the testimony, the accounts of those who worked inside the factories, who felt the foreman's blows, who watched colleagues carried out at shift's end, who learned to perform invisible, to make themselves small enough to survive one more day. Those accounts do not simplify over time. They do not become easier to hold. Primo Levi wrote that the duty of survivors was to remember accurately, not heroically, not with imposed meaning, but accurately. To describe what they saw in the language of what it was. What it was this: a continent-spanning system in which human beings were treated as inputs, not as people, as inputs, allocated, optimized, discarded. The companies that participated in that system had names. Many of those names still exist. Some of them are, in various forms, still operating. Building cars, generating electricity, manufacturing medicines. Their supply chains run across the world. Their annual reports project confidence and social responsibility. None of that erases what the invoices say. 4 Reichsmarks per day, paid to the SS. For a human being, The accounting, finally, is ours to complete. Not in courts, though courts were and remain important. Not in corporate statements, though statements matter, but in memory. In the insistence that the names are spoken, the mechanisms described, the human cost acknowledged without euphemism or diffusion. Because the last surviving witnesses are in their 90s. Within a generation, there will be no living memory of Monowitz, of Ravensbrück, of Wolfsburg's wartime nursery. What remains, when the last witness is gone, is what we choose to remember. Choose carefully. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read every one and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions, keep seeking the truth,